The Maypole Committee of Flinchcombe met precisely as it always had, without enthusiasm, without efficiency, and with the sensation of having been dragged reluctantly into public duty by heredity rather than desire. It was held in the back room of the Women's Cooperative Hall, a space which had once been intended for lectures, but now contained little more than a warped trestle table, 6 mismatched chairs, and the faint, lingering memory of boiled cabbage from a luncheon 3 days prior. Councillor Alfred Spinks sat at the head of the table, clutching a pencil as though he was seriously considering its potential to betray him. "I think," he said, in the wounded tone of a man frequently surprised by responsibility, "we can agree that bunting shall remain traditional." No one disagreed because nobody had the energy to form an alternative adjective. At exactly 11 minutes past 8, the door opened to reveal Miss Dora Pike, who had no committee role whatsoever, but believed herself ethically responsible for all matters involving baked goods. "I left the bridge rolls cooling," she announced. "If any of you touch them with unwashed hands, I shall name names." Her contribution to the agenda was deemed complete. It was during this interval of administrative exhaustion that Mr. Edwin Hobb, proprietor of Hobb's Greengrocery and chair of the Finance Subcommittee, reached into the small tin cash box he kept beside him. He paused. He reached in again, more deliberately. "My till," he said faintly, though the till was in his shop and the box was in his hand. Councillor Spinks looked up slowly. "What about it, Hobb?" "There appears," said Hobb, staring into the metal box with a softness that reserved itself for ruins and funerals, "to be something inside that was not previously of the village economy." He tipped the box carefully onto the table. Among the coins, the folded pound notes, and a paperclip which had never clipped anything properly in its life, lay 3 pearls. They were not large, they were not dramatic. They were simply, unmistakably, pearls, faintly luminous, politely rounded, and entirely in the wrong social class. There was a pause. "I think," said Miss Pike, leaning forward with interest normally reserved for funerals and cake collapses, "those are not radishes." Councillor Spinks cleared his throat so hard it seemed to take a small piece of his dignity with it. Pearls in Flinchcombe possessed no natural enemies except improbability. Nobody touched them. Nobody admitted to understanding them. Mr. Hobb, whose comfort derived almost exclusively from predictable pricing structures, began to sweat with the dignity of a man who did not wish to appear capable of criminal thought. "Perhaps," suggested Spinks with a bravery he did not feel, "they are costume." "They are cold," said Hobb, who had brushed them with his finger before anyone could stop him. "Costume tends to be warm." Miss Pike nodded, as though temperature had solved crimes before. At the far end of the room there was a mild cough. Inspector Purbright, who had not been part of the committee, nor invited to the committee, nor formally noticed by the committee, was seated by the window as if he had been installed with the curtains. He had come to discuss a missing bicycle. He stayed because of silence. "Curious," Purbright observed mildly, "more to the air than to the people." They looked at him as if he were a polite piece of furniture that had just spoken. "Curious how?" Spinks asked, already regretting having asked. "They appear," said Purbright, "to have been placed rather than lost." There was a long, morally uncomfortable quiet. Mr. Hobb protested first, not because he was guilty, but because there are men who protest at the sight of anything not labelled in pence. "I don't sell jewellery," he said. "I sell turnips. On good days I sell peaches. I have never trafficked in marine valuables." "No one suggested you had?" said Purbright gently. "I feel as though someone has," Hobb replied wildly. "Suggested me." Miss Pike leaned closer to the pearls. "They look deliberate," she said. "They do," murmured Purbright. No one asked him what he meant because they did not want the answer to be bigger than the room. The meeting dissolved without formally doing so. That was its particular skill. The cash box remained on the table, the pearls remained inside, and when they were later carefully wrapped in a clean handkerchief that had never been used for its intended purpose, they were already beginning to change the way the town held its mouth. Somewhere that evening in Flintcombe, a man walked past the greengrocer's shop and did not look at the window. Someone else looked far too hard. And Inspector Purbright, walking back through the narrow street under lamplight, reflected only that ordinary things, when placed wrongly, tended to disturb people more than crimes. By morning, Flintcombe had accepted the pearls in the manner it accepted heavy rain or unexpected relatives, with a public display of mild resistance and a private thrill of possession. The market square, which usually concerned itself with cabbages, eggs, and the relative morality of imported oranges, carried a new excitement that travelled faster than rational explanation. Mrs. Tyndall at the bread stall was the first to adapt the story to something she could live with. "I heard," she told no one in particular, "that they came from a foreign gentleman with no suitcase and very white hands." She had not heard this. No one had seen a foreign gentleman, but it felt correct, which in Flintcombe was a higher standard than truth. At Hobbs' greengrocery, the bell above the door rang with its usual honesty. Inside, Mr. Edwin Hobbs stood behind the counter with the stiffness of a man who did not trust the walls. He had not slept. Well, pearls, it turned out, did not belong to the silent hours. They swam through conscience. Mrs. Larkin, who purchased carrots with the air of a public official, leaned forward at the counter. "Were they real?" she asked. "They were inappropriate," Hobbs said, which for him settled the matter. Behind her, young Thomas Weaver pretended to examine apples while listening like a future magistrate. Across the street, Mrs. Pole from the drapery shop claimed loudly that jewellery was often hidden in common places and that it explained much about modern decline. By mid-morning, the story had acquired shape, direction, and several unnecessary flourishes. Someone had seen a stranger near the back lane. Someone had heard tapping at the window. Someone else had always said that Edwin Hobb walked oddly for a man who sold potatoes. In truth, Edwin Hobb walked exactly as he always had, which was to say, cautiously and with respect for gravity. Inspector Purbright, moving through Market Street with his politely unhurried stride, observed, without cornering, the atmosphere. He passed the butcher's shop, the ironmonger, and the post office in which Miss Anstruther had been holding a conversation with the clock for almost 30 years. "Morning, Inspector," she said, without stopping the conversation. "You'll find more pearls in the vicar's sermons than in the greengrocer's till." It was unclear what she meant, which made it valuable. At 11 minutes past 10, Purbright entered Hobbs' shop. The bell performed its duty. The pears were doing their best. The pumpkins looked resigned. "Good morning, Mr. Hobb," he said. "Morning," Hobb replied, though his tone suggested evening. Purbright looked at the counter, the scale, the unaligned stack of brown paper bags. He did not look at the cash drawer. "I understand," he said gently, "that you were surprised." "I don't like surprises," said Hobb. "Not in drawers." "Nor do most people," Purbright nodded. "Do you ever leave the shop unattended?" "Only for the length of time it takes to fetch a crate," Hobb said. "About as long as a disappointment." "Who has a key?" "Myself," Hobb said, "and my nephew, and the spare which I keep hidden." "Where?" Hobb hesitated as though the walls might be listening. "Behind the calendar of root vegetables." Purbright absorbed this with the composure of a man noting the habits of birds. "Has anyone asked you about the pearls this morning?" "Only in ways that hurt," Hob said. "And one woman asked if she could see them like you look at a cut of beef." Purbright thanked him and left, neither comforted nor distressed. Outside, the town was ripening under the sun. It was market day, and Flinchcombe performed itself, baskets carried with sociable strain, hats adjusted as signals, jokes repeated by men who had liked them once in 1959. At the public conveniences, Councillor Spinks stood with an air of civic injury addressing Mr. Lobb from the hardware shop. "It must be theft," Spinks said. "There's no other framework." "There are always other frameworks," Lobb said, and immediately regretted sounding philosophical. Spinks noticed Purbright approaching and straightened. "Inspector," he said, loudly enough to be overheard, "this sort of thing frightens respectable commerce." "Does it?" Purbright asked, mild as bread pudding. "It suggests sorcery," Spinks continued, having never dealt with sorcery before. "It suggests," Purbright said softly, "that something has been placed where it does not belong." Spinks felt this was unhelpful. By afternoon, the town had settled on a version it liked. It involved strangers, motives too large for the town, and the vague suspicion of travelling people who had not actually passed through in years. No one liked the smaller explanation, which hovered unspoken, that the pearls had been introduced by familiarity, not intrusion. At the back of the greengrocer's, the narrow lane remained quiet. The crate of cabbages leaned, as it always had. The small window was smeared with ordinary fingerprints of time. Inspector Purbright passed there once. He did not touch anything. He did not take notes. He listened. From inside the shop came the sound of Hob counting coins with wounded patience. From the street came the careful footsteps of people trying not to appear deliberate. And above it all hung the social fact that Flinchcombe, having found itself the owner of mystery, was reluctant to lose it too quickly. That evening, in a neat sitting room with antimacassars that looked recently offended, someone spoke of the pearls in a voice that was not curious, not alarmed, but irritated. "They should never have been found," the voice said. And somewhere else, a woman folded her hands and thought it curious that such small things had begun to move so many careful lives. Inspector Purbright, at his desk that night, examined nothing tangible at all. He considered timing, he considered habit. He considered the curious way people told the truth when they thought they were decorating it, and he thought, without committing the indecency of saying it aloud, that the town was lying badly. But not loudly enough yet. By the third day, Flinchcombe had moved from excitement to choreography. Gossip no longer stumbled. It walked with purpose, went calling, and knew when to pause for effect. The pearls had ceased to be objects and had become symbols, which was far more dangerous in a town that preferred symbols to facts. Inspector Purbright began the morning at the post office, where time moved slowly out of courtesy. Miss Anstruther had already decided what she felt about the matter, which was that it represented a general collapse in standards and a specific collapse in men who handled melons. "They weren't always so," she said, sliding a stamp along the counter like a small act of judgment. "We used to know where things belonged." "Things," said Purbright gently, "have had a habit of moving for some time." She sniffed. "The pearls," she said, "were seen by Mrs. Dalrymple's cousin's lodger's brother. He says they shone unnaturally." "I see," said Purbright, meaning he saw nothing at all but appreciated the line of thought. From there he walked to the ironmonger's, where Mr. Lobb polished a kettle that could not by any moral system become cleaner. "Hob didn't steal them," Lobb said without being asked. "Why not?" Purbright inquired. "He flinches at expensive oranges," Lobb replied. "A man who distrusts clementines doesn't bargain in pearls." It was, Purbright thought, a persuasive piece of sociology. At the draper's, Mrs. Pole rearranged ribbons that were already aligned with militant precision. "You can always tell," she told Purbright, "when something is placed rather than dropped. It has intention about it, like a badly stitched hem." "What makes you sure they were placed?" Purbright asked. "They were too tidy," she said. "Dropped things have panic in them." This was noted not on paper, but in the particular quiet space of Purbright's mind that remained empty enough to be useful. Later he stood in the narrow back lane behind Hobbs' shop. The air was cool there, as if the sun refused to involve itself in cramped morality. The small window remained closed. The cabbages, resigned and spherical, leaned against the wall like dependable witnesses. A sound came from behind him. "Looking for footmarks?" asked Councillor Spinks, who had approached in the confident manner of a man who had never found any. "Not today," said Purbright. "Then what, Inspector?" "Explanations," Purbright replied. Spinks frowned. "I tell you what it is," he said. "It's theft from outside. You'll find a rough character. You can always find one if you look with commitment." "That is frequently so," Purbright agreed. "But sometimes, Councillor, the trouble does not arrive. Sometimes it lives politely in the parish." Spinks did not enjoy this thought and walked away with a cough meant to dismiss ideas. By afternoon, Purbright sat in the back room of the grocer's and provisioning store, drinking a cup of tea that had the air of being strained through a conscience. Mrs. Eliza Marr, who sold tinned fruit and controlled several unspoken arrangements in the town, sat opposite him. Her hands were folded, which meant she was either calm or about to be. "People like a puzzle," she said. "Yes," Purbright replied. "It gives them part," she went on. "They stop being themselves and start being witnesses." "Do you like the puzzle?" he asked. "No," she said. "Puzzles suggest untidiness." "Did you ever go into Hobbs' shop after closing?" he asked. She smiled, but not at him. "Respectable women," she said, "are never where they are said to be, Inspector. But we are always where it matters." Outside, young Thomas Weaver hovered again, pretending to examine plums. He had taken to lingering, like a man hoping to inherit a conspiracy. "Did you see anything unusual yesterday?" Purbright asked him gently. "No, sir," Thomas replied quickly. "Only old Mr. Clegg going in and out the back lane like he'd lost something." "What does old Mr. Clegg often lose?" Purbright asked. "His dignity," Thomas said, then regretted it. Mr. Clegg, it transpired, had been a clerk of modest failure and ambitious facial hair. He now spent his time walking with the careful slowness of a man hoping to look purposeful. Purbright found him near the allotments. "Good afternoon, Mr. Clegg," he said. Clegg jumped the way guilty men jump, and innocent men should not. "I've done nothing," Clegg said. "I didn't say you had," Purbright replied. "I was just passing the back of the shop," Clegg insisted. "Were you?" asked Purbright mildly. "I thought I'd dropped my pipe there once," Clegg said. "And did you?" Purbright asked. "No," said Clegg. They stood in silence. A lie hung between them. Not a dramatic one, not even a clever one, just an ordinary, badly folded lie. That evening, Flintcombe quieted itself. Curtains were drawn. Lamps were lit in the careful manner of people who did not wish to appear unpredictable. Someone spoke of the pearls again, in a tone that suggested ownership of a version. In a small front parlour, Mrs. Dalrymple poured tea and said, "It is all very strange, and I don't think it began with the pearls at all." Across the street, a window moved slightly. A curtain was adjusted too carefully. Inspector Purbright walked home under lamplight and thought how lies, when repeated often enough, began to show their shape. They did not sound wrong. They sat wrong. And he thought the town was beginning to sit very uncomfortably indeed. By the fourth day, Flinchcombe had tired of uncertainty. It was not that the town disliked mystery. It disliked untidiness, and mystery without a narrative was a form of social clutter. Solutions, even poor ones, were preferable to the awkward silence of not knowing where to point a moral finger. The solution arrived in the form of Councillor Alfred Spinks, who had slept badly and decided that, as a result, the town should sleep better. It was announced, informally but loudly, in the butcher's shop, where declarations carried weight because they were delivered beside meat. "It's Clegg," Spinks said to an audience of 2 men waiting for bacon and a woman who pretended not to listen. "It has the look of him." Mr. Barker, the butcher, sharpened his knife with professional neutrality. "What look is that?" he asked. "The sideways look," Spinks said, "the sort that never meets your eye directly and walks about lanes for no clear reason." This was enough. It always was. By lunchtime, the theory had put on a respectable coat. Mr. Clegg, already a man of marginal position, found himself promoted to central criminal without being consulted. Older grievances were located. Old conversations were remembered. Small, pointless habits were reinterpreted as sinister. Inspector Purbright heard of this not at once, but in stages, as rumours acquired weight and shape. He was in the library when the librarian, Mrs. Hatch, whispered to him as though discussing treason. "They've decided," she said. "Decided what?" he asked. "That the business has been solved," she replied. "It's that Clegg man, walks badly, never smiles properly, and he once argued with the late Mr. Danvers over a rhubarb crown." Purbright nodded, because it was kind. In the afternoon, a small meeting of concerned town figures gathered in the back room of the hall again. It was not called a meeting, because that would have implied procedure. It was described as a necessary conversation. Spinks stood like a man prepared to be reasonable in public. "We must show," he said, "that Flinchcombe does not accept disturbances with indifference." Mrs. Marr crossed her hands. "And what," she asked, "do we accept with enthusiasm?" Spinks ignored this. "We have a suspect," he said, "a man who has no clear work, no clear habits, and no clear respect for normal walking arrangements." "Has he pearls?" asked Mrs. Pike. "No," Spinks said. "Then I don't see," she said, "how he's done very well at it." This was regarded as obstruction. Purbright stood at the back of the room, a little apart, as though he had been grown there like a coat stand. No one asked for his opinion. They avoided his eyes, which suggested to him a level of certainty they were unwilling to test. That evening he walked to Mr. Clegg's lodgings. The house was thin, like a man who could no longer afford confidence. The door was opened by Clegg himself, who looked as if he had not been visited by luck for some years. "Good evening," Purbright said. "I haven't done it," Clegg said. "You have done something," Purbright replied gently. "Otherwise you would not have opened the door like that." Clegg's room was small, careful, and strangely tidy. There were no pearls, there was no sense of secret wealth. There was the unmistakable odour of loneliness that has been polished over time. "Tell me," Purbright said, "why you walk behind the shops." "I don't like being seen," Clegg said. "People remember old failures too clearly from the front." "Did you put anything into Mr. Hobbs' till?" Purbright asked. "No," Clegg said. "I wouldn't dare. I once returned a penny because it felt dishonest." This was said without pride. Purbright left him there, not comforted but unconvinced. Across town the assumption hardened. People spoke of Clegg in tones of sympathy that were not meant kindly. It is a cruelty of small towns that when they decide upon your guilt, they feel generous, expressing concern. At Hobbs' shop, the bell continued to ring. Business continued, although customers leaned closer when they spoke, as if openness might be contagious. "You'll feel better now they've found him," Mrs. Larkin told Hob. "They haven't found anything," Hob replied, which for him was a brave, philosophical stance. By late afternoon, Councillor Spinks felt almost cheerful. He had the look of a man who had put a difficult thing somewhere distant. "We can move on," he said to Mr. Lobb. "These things are like boils. They need lancing." Mr. Lobb nodded, though the metaphor troubled him. Inspector Purbright stood again in the back lane. He noticed a thin scratch on the sill of the small window. It was not new enough to be fresh. It was not old enough to be forgotten. He did not touch it. He simply allowed it to exist inside his attention. The comfortable answer now sat heavily in Flinchcombe. It made breathing easier and thinking harder. That night, in a house with a carefully polished brass knocker, a man removed his spectacles and allowed himself a smile that did not reach his eyes. "They've done it for us," he said softly. In another house, a woman folded a handkerchief with more care than necessary and wondered whether 2 more days would be enough. Inspector Purbright at his desk did not think of Clegg at all. He thought of people who were relieved too quickly. He thought of Councillor Spinks, who had decided for the town, and he thought, without saying it, that truth in Flinchcombe had just been placed somewhere very inconvenient. By the 5th day, Flinchcombe had adjusted to its chosen comfort. The name of Clegg moved through conversations with a tone of resigned duty, as if guilt were a public office he had been elected to without consent. The Pearls sat wrapped in a handkerchief inside a small tin box at the police station, where they were treated with awkward politeness, like visitors from a louder world. Mr. Hobbs' cash drawer, however, began to misbehave. It did not refuse entirely. It did not offer a dramatic protest. It simply caught, fractionally, the way a thought catches at the back of the mind when one has forgotten a name. It slid open smoothly 9 times out of 10. On the 10th, it paused with a faint resistance, as if something within the wood had decided to become thoughtful. Hob noticed it because he noticed everything. He had noticed it on the 2nd morning, and by the 5th day it had assumed in his imagination the moral weight of a confession. He cleaned the rails, he polished the edges, he scolded it quietly. It remained uncooperative. Inspector Purbright came in at 10:30, as he did when he wished to appear unhurried. Hob greeted him with a nod that hovered between relief and complaint. "I believe my drawer is developing opinions," Hob said. Purbright leaned slightly against the counter. "In what way?" he asked. "It objects to opening," Hob replied. "Only now and again, but enough to make a man feel accused." Purbright did not smile. He did not approach the drawer. He merely allowed his gaze to rest on the thin line between wood and counter. "Has it always done this?" he asked. "No," said Hob, "not until the evening of the committee meeting." This said nothing and said everything. Outside, the market performed itself with careful diligence. Women discussed beans with exaggerated seriousness. Men debated the ripeness of tomatoes as if it were a civic duty. Ordinary life continued, but it continued slightly out of alignment, like a picture that has slipped a fraction on the wall. Mrs. Marr passed Hobbs' window twice in 10 minutes, though she had no need of celery. She paused both times at the display, not to admire the produce, but to glance at the counter's far end, where the drawer lay concealed. Across the square, Councillor Spinks stood, with Mr. Lobb, and congratulated the air on its clarity. "It settles the nerves," Spinks said, "to know where one stands." Mr. Lobb nodded, though he had the uncomfortable feeling that the ground had tilted slightly. Behind the greengrocers, the narrow lane remained modest and still. Purbright walked there slowly, as though pacing out the rhythm of a forgotten tune. He knelt, not directly at the window, but close enough to let the wood declare itself. The scratch on the sill now appeared less like a scratch and more like a decision. A thin, deliberate line, not made by accident or years, but by contact. Not a tool, not a knife. Something softer, dragged rather than struck. He did not touch it. He listened to it in the private way he listened to all quiet things. From the corner of his eye he saw movement. Thomas Weaver stood at a distance, pretending to study the brickwork, which required no study at all. "Do you often stand here?" Purbright asked him, gently, without turning. "Sometimes," Thomas said too quickly. "Why?" "To think," the boy said, which was both honest and unconvincing. "At what time did you stand here 3 evenings ago?" Purbright asked. Thomas hesitated. "After supper," he said. "Not long after." "Did you see anyone?" Purbright asked. "I saw a shadow," Thomas replied. "Not a person, just a shadow, moving wrong." "Wrong how?" "Like it didn't belong to what was making it," the boy said, and looked frightened that he had said something real. At midday, Mrs. Pike visited Hobbs for onions and moral reinforcement. She watched him struggle with the drawer. "It catches," she observed. "It shouldn't," Hobbs said. She leaned over, peering with the dramatic interest of a woman observing a fainting goat. "Feels as if someone put something where it didn't settle," she said. "I had a cake like that once." Purbright came in just as Hobb tried the drawer again. It stuck, fractionally, as though acknowledging the presence of witnesses, and then yielded. "May I?" Purbright asked. Hobb stepped aside, looking as if he were surrendering a family member. Purbright slid the drawer in. He slid it out. He did this without hurry, without show. On the fourth movement, the wood caught with the delicate reluctance of a tiny, tired joint. "There," Hobb said, pointing with vindictive triumph. "Yes," Purbright said. He did not look inside. He looked beneath. He saw the faintest swelling where something, once wedged, had kissed the grain of the wood too closely. That afternoon, Councillor Spinks walked past the shop and did not go in. He did not like drawers. They contained possibilities. In a sitting room with lace curtains, a woman examined her hands and noticed that her fingers smelled faintly of soap and something older, something mineral. "They won't look there," she said to herself, too softly to be overheard. And somewhere else, a man adjusted his cufflinks and found they no longer felt comfortable. That night, Purbright returned to the station and looked, for the first time, at the pearls in their handkerchief. He did not weigh them. He did not test them. He simply noted how small they were and how perfectly quiet they remained. Then he thought of the drawer. He thought of the fraction of resistance. He thought of the way people adjusted objects when they wished to hide something emotional rather than practical. And without stating it, he understood that something about the town was beginning to swell against its own grain. By the 6th day, Flinchcombe began to show the fatigue that comes from maintaining a lie that is too neat. Respectability, which had been worn like a stiff collar, started to chafe. The comfortable certainty about Mr. Clegg remained in public, but in private rooms and behind drawn curtains, softer, more irregular doubts began to form. Inspector Purbright moved through these doubts like a man strolling through mist, never pushing, never hurrying, allowing the fog to reveal itself instead of dispersing it. He began the day in the front parlour of Mrs. Eliza Marr, whose lace curtains admitted just enough light to flatter a reputation. She poured tea with the careful precision of someone accustomed to listening while seeming otherwise occupied. "You have many interests in town," Purbright said, observing the teaspoons. I have responsibilities, she corrected. Do they ever become inconvenient? He asked. She paused just long enough to think of 3 things that were. Sometimes, she said. But decent people learn to arrange their inconveniences so they don't become visible. Purbright nodded as though speaking of furniture rather than habits. Do you know, he asked, anyone who might wish a public disturbance to be solved very quickly? Mrs. Marr smiled thinly. Everyone, she said. It stops them thinking about themselves. From there, he walked to the drapery shop, where Mrs. Pole had taken to aligning pins in straight, accusing lines. This business, she said without preamble, has upset the rhythm of things. Whose rhythm? Purbright asked. Mrs. Pole stuck a pin into the cushion, perhaps harder than necessary. There are women, she said, who manage quietly, who arrange collections, charitable matters, little movements of money that do not concern the council because the council would only breathe heavily over them. And if such arrangements were threatened? Purbright asked. She drew thread through a needle. Then those women, she said, might wish attention to fall elsewhere. In the afternoon, Purbright paid a visit to the vicarage. Reverend Mallory offered biscuits that tasted morally instructive. Pearls, the Reverend said when asked. It seems an odd temptation. Temptation often appears ordinary, Purbright replied. The Reverend folded his hands. I have known women in this town who can be moved to extraordinary measures, he said. Not for greed, for preservation. He did not say who. He did not need to. By late afternoon, the back lane behind Hobbs' shop was no longer as quiet as it pretended. Purbright noticed the telltale traces of human attention, the slight realignment of stacked crates, the faint shift in loose gravel. People had been standing there when they said they had not. Waiting, perhaps? Thinking, certainly. He met Mrs. Dalrymple as she came around the corner, carrying a basket that was too light to be innocent. Inspector, she said, with polite surprise. Good afternoon, he replied. You must find it all very curious, she said. I find people, Purbright said, more curious than objects. She laughed too quickly. We all have things we'd rather not have picked over, she said. Do we? He asked gently. She adjusted her gloves. In small towns, she said, respectability is a matter of arrangement. He watched her go. Her steps were light, but her shoulders carried a tension that had nothing to do with baskets. That evening, at Hobbs, business carried on with exaggerated normality. Customers stood a fraction too close, leaned a fraction too far, and asked questions they were not brave enough to admit were not about potatoes. Have you ever lost anything valuable? Mrs. Larkin asked Hobb. Only my youth, he said. Have you had visitors after closing? She persisted. Only my thoughts, he replied. Councillor Spinks passed by and paused, though he pretended not to. He looked at the window and felt the discomfort of a man who had put his certainty in the wrong place. They were meant to speak of Clegg, he thought angrily. They were not meant to look inward. That night, in a tidy front room with a respectable clock, Mrs. Pole removed a small parcel from behind a row of folded napkins. She did not open it. She only touched it, as one touches a bruise. In another house, Mrs. Marr counted money that had been counted before and wondered when she had begun being afraid of drawers. Elsewhere, a man with careful cuffs wrote a note and burned it, though it had not been read by anyone but himself. Inspector Purbright, in his small, orderly sitting-room, poured himself tea and did not drink it. He thought of women who managed without offices. He thought of men who arrived at their conclusions too quickly. He thought of the drawer again and how it resisted only when asked at the wrong angle. The town was no longer lying loudly. It was lying politely. It was lying together. and he understood, without putting it into words, that the matter was no longer about pearls at all, but about the quiet arrangements that respectable people made when their ordinary lives grew uncomfortably close to truth. By the 7th day, Flinchcombe had begun to feel like a room in which the windows had been shut for too long. The air remained polite, but it had grown close. Words were chosen with more care. Footsteps lingered where once they passed. People were looking too often at places they claimed not to think about. The second discovery arrived not with noise, but with embarrassment. It began with the window. Mr. Hobb had always regarded the small, high window at the back of his shop as a concession to light rather than a source of thought. It admitted a pale, apologetic sunbeam in the mornings and collected damp in the evenings. It had never been, in his mind, an entrance. That morning it disagreed with him. He noticed the latch was loose while he was rearranging a crate of turnips, whose chief talent was disapproval. At first he assumed it was age. Everything in Flinchcombe was allowed a certain laxity in joints, but when he touched the frame, it moved, only slightly enough. He stood there with the careful stillness of a man who had found his own name used in an unfamiliar way. Inspector Purbright was sent for, although "sent for" in Flinchcombe meant that Miss Anstruther rang the bell twice in a particular rhythm, and someone walked quickly. Purbright arrived without haste. Hobb led him to the back, apologizing to the air. "I hadn't the habit of checking it," he said. "You shouldn't have had to," Purbright replied. The wood bore the faint marks of pressure, not a break, not a split, just the gentle insistence of hands that had tested the window's obedience. "What do you think?" Hobb asked. "I think," said Purbright, "it has been opened by someone who did not wish it to be noticed." Outside, the lane offered its usual blankness. The crates leaned. The stones remained innocent. Only the air felt slightly rearranged, as if it were remembering something it refused to describe. By midday, the news travelled, though news was too grand a word. It moved as inference. Mrs. Larkin told Mrs. Pole that a window had been interfered with. Mrs. Pole told Mrs. Marr that interference suggested planning. Mrs. Marr told no one, but folded her hands tighter. Clegg's name, which had been carried lightly for days, began to feel suddenly wrong in the mouth. "He's too clumsy for that sort of thing," Mr. Lobb said to the butcher. "Too nervous," Mr. Barker replied. "Would have broken it." Councillor Spinks attempted certainty and found it slipping. "This doesn't change anything," he said loudly in the square. Several people looked at him without speaking. Silence in Flinchcombe meant poor support. That afternoon, Purbright took a slow turn through the adjoining streets. He passed the vicarage, where curtains moved fractionally too quickly. He passed Mrs. Dalrymple's house, where the step had been swept despite no visible dirt. He passed Mrs. Marr's shop, where the till rang once when no customer had entered. He knocked at Mrs. Pole's door later, gently, as if not wishing to upset the wood. She received him with the air of a woman who had rehearsed politeness. "You're thinking of the window," she said. "I am," Purbright admitted. "You won't find what you think," she said. "I'm not thinking of finding," he replied. "I'm thinking of placing." She tilted her head. "You're a disquieting man," she said. He smiled faintly, which is to say, he did not. In the lane, late afternoon light fell at a slant, as it always did when things were about to become visible. The loose latch caught the brightness like a small confession. Thomas Weaver stood at the corner, trying not to stand at the corner. "Did you come here last night?" Purbright asked him conversationally. "No, sir," Thomas said. Did anyone? Purbright asked. I heard footsteps, he said. Slow ones, like someone thinking while walking. Did you see them? No, Thomas replied. They used the side the light doesn't reach. This was useful. That evening, Flinchcomb's sitting rooms became places of quieter speech. They've opened a window, someone said. Then it wasn't meant to be Clegg, someone else answered. No, said a third voice. That was too easy. In a neat parlour, Mrs. Marr sat with her hands folded so tightly that her ring left a mark on her skin. They are looking in the wrong places, she said aloud, though she was alone. Across town, Mrs. Pole removed the small parcel from behind the napkins again and moved it, not nearer, not farther, simply elsewhere, as if location itself were the problem. Mr. Hobb, at closing time, stood for a long while staring at the blown latch. He felt offended in a way he hadn't known before. It was not fear. It was the sense of private space having been breached by polite fingers. Purbright returned in the growing dusk and stood in the lane once more. He noted how the crates were just perceptibly repositioned from the previous day. He noted how the ground held no evidence because the town had walked too careful a dance upon it. He thought of how humans like to solve things by choosing the least disturbing answer. He thought of how windows were opened by those who wished to enter without being seen. At a window across the street, a curtain shifted too slowly. In that house, a voice murmured, "They will go no further than this." The voice was wrong. Inspector Purbright, beneath the pale evening sky, did not consider the pearls. He considered the latch, he considered the angle of hands, and he understood that the centre of the disturbance had moved, quietly and politely, away from men like Clegg and towards people who had never once expected to be examined at all. On the 8th day, Flinchcomb developed a new talent, behaving naturally under observation. It was not in truth a talent at all. It was a strain. Doors were opened with unnecessary grace. Curtains were adjusted with false casualness. Conversations slid into older, safer topics just slightly too late. Inspector Purbright did not press. He watched. He walked slowly that morning along the street of shops, greeting faces that rearranged themselves when they saw him. Respectability had acquired a thin, brittle quality, like china left too long in hot water. He began with no destination and found, as he often did, that he arrived somewhere useful. At the milliner's, Mrs. Dane was adjusting a hat that no one would ever wear with a clear conscience. She spoke without waiting to be asked. "People are not doing as well as they look," she said. "Are they ever?" Purbright replied. She lowered her voice, which made it significant. "Mrs. Marr comes in too often," she said. "Never buys more than she needs. Always looks as though she's making up her mind." "About what?" he asked. "About how much of herself she can afford to show," Mrs. Dane said. From there he walked past the post office. Miss Anstruther, who had once spoken about the clock as a confidant, had fallen silent entirely when she saw him, which was, in its own way, a confession. At Mrs. Marr's shop, the bell rang with unnecessary cheer. She stood behind the counter with folded calm. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he returned. They observed each other politely, as two people do when neither wishes to be unreasonable. "You've had many visitors," he said. "I trade," she answered. "Trade invites feet." "Do the same feet visit the back of the greengrocer's?" he asked. Her fingers tightened almost invisibly. "Respectable people," she said, "do not linger in lanes." "I find," Purbright said, "that respectable people are very fond of lanes." She did not reply. Outside, Councillor Spinks performed his duties of reassurance by talking louder. He addressed three men who had not asked to be addressed. "The authority of the council must be seen," he said. Mr. Barker nodded, though he had begun to sharpen his knife for reasons that had nothing to do with meat. "And how," asked Mr. Lobb quietly, "is authority seen?" "By endings," said Spinks. "We must have an ending." This troubled them because the ending now felt as if it belonged to someone else. By midday, Purbright found himself in the lane once more. It had acquired the disturbed silence of a theatre after a poor performance. The window latch sat quietly in its damaged modesty. The sill held its thin, determined mark, like a line written by a careful hand. Someone else stood there. Mrs. Dalrymple did not start when she saw him. Starting would have looked guilty. Instead, she looked inconvenienced. "I was merely passing," she said. "Were you?" Purbright asked gently. "Yes," she said. "One passes." "Do you often pass this way?" he asked. "Not often," she said. "You were seen here on the evening the window was loosened," he said. Her eyes flickered, which in Flinchcombe was close to panic. "I heard something," she said quickly. "I came to see." "What did you see?" he asked. She looked at the stones. "Nothing," she said. "But I thought it might be a cat." "A determined cat," Purbright observed. She laughed too quickly. "Yes," she said. "Very determined." That afternoon, Purbright sat alone for a while in the small tea-room near the station. He did not drink much. He listened to the muted sounds of cups and confidences. He thought of patterns. He thought of drawers that resisted only at certain angles. He thought of windows that loosened their loyalty to the wall. He thought without hurry of how people behaved when watched. They did not flee. They did not confess. They adjusted. They moved their hands closer to their bodies. They chose their words with tighter care. They glanced, not forward, but sideways, as if assessing how much their neighbor already knew. Late in the afternoon, a girl carrying bread lingered too long by the greengrocer's back entry and then walked away quickly when she thought she had been seen. No one followed her. No one needed to. She was only another pair of eyes. At sunset, the town turned soft again. Lamps were lit. Doors were drawn in. Respectability resumed its usual posture, except it now watched itself in mirrors. In a kitchen with perfectly scrubbed tiles, Mrs. Marr stood at the sink and held her hands under water longer than necessary. She thought of the small parcel in Mrs. Pole's house, though she had never been told of it. She thought of drawers that stuck and windows that opened. "They will stop at the man," she thought, and felt no comfort in it. In another house, Mrs. Pole rearranged her napkins again, though they had not moved. She touched the space where the parcel no longer lay, and felt the absence like a bruise. Somewhere else, Councillor Spinks attempted to sleep and found that thoughts did not respect civic office. Inspector Purbright walked once more through the quiet streets. He imagined, without forcing the thought, the hands that had tested the latch. He imagined their hesitation, their certainty, their belief that the town would never look in that direction. He thought of the way people dropped their voices when watched rather than when guilty. They performed morality like a habit. And he understood, resting lightly on the idea without naming it, that he was not looking for a criminal in Flinchcombe at all. He was looking for the one person who had altered their performance just enough to betray themselves. And he knew quietly that he was almost ready to ask the sort of question that would not be answered honestly, but would be answered in movement. On the 9th day, Inspector Purbright decided that the time had come for tea. It was not, in ordinary circumstances, a dangerous decision. In Flinchcombe, however, timing was everything, and tea had the potential to become an instrument of quiet disturbance. He did not choose the vicarage, where tea came with moral undertones, nor the station tea room, where it came with conversations that wandered. He chose Mrs. Eliza Marr's front parlour. The request was made as all effective disturbances were made, politely and with no explanation. Mrs. Marr received the request with a smile that had been trained for years not to collapse under strain. "Of course, Inspector," she said. "At 4:30. "4:30, Purbright agreed. The time was chosen because it was awkward. It interrupted the shopping mind. It disturbed the nap of clerks. It made respectable women rush small duties in order to appear unhurried. By 4:15, Mrs. Marr's sitting room looked as if nothing had ever gone wrong in it. The lace curtains hung in deliberate innocence. The chairs had been placed in defensible positions. The tea service glittered with the faint aggression of polished silver. Purbright arrived exactly on time and sat at the edge of the chair as though he had never learned to relax. "I won't keep you long," he said. "Please," she replied. "I insist you stay." This was her first miscalculation, though she did not know it then. He drank his tea slowly. He spoke of nothing that mattered, of the weather, of the slow decline in the reliability of bootlaces, of how Flintcombe had once won a small prize for civic tidiness. Mrs. Marr listened with care. She answered with restraint. They circled one another like polite dancers who knew the music, but not the steps. At exactly 20 minutes to 5, he said casually, "I may need to look again at the window behind Mr. Hobbs' shop." She did not look at him. She looked at the sugar bowl. Her left hand tightened slightly around the teacup. "Of course," she said. "You must do your duty." He waited. He did not accuse. He did not pursue. He spoke instead of how odd it was that small windows were so often overlooked. "They can be opened," he said lightly. "Closed, adjusted. All without anyone feeling directly involved." Her breath changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but he heard it. When he left, he did not return to the lane. He walked instead through the longer street, allowing time to slide like a thin blade through the air. He passed Mrs. Pole's house and noticed that a curtain moved twice, then stilled itself too firmly. He stood by the ironmonger's and spoke briefly to no one in particular. "I wonder," he said to the afternoon, "who might dislike it if I examined that catch more closely?" The afternoon absorbed this with politeness. By evening something had shifted in Flintcombe. It was not visible, it was not scurrying, it was not loud, it was wrongness in the air. At 6 o'clock, Mrs. Marr stood at her kitchen sink and let the water run too long. Her thoughts moved in short, precise lines. He spoke of the latch, she thought. Not of the pearls, not of the drawer, the latch. Across town, Mrs. Pole sat in her dining room and unfolded her napkins and folded them again, as if trying to remember where her hands had been 2 nights before. The small parcel was no longer in the place she remembered. She had moved it. She could not remember why. At 6:15, Councillor Spinks walked past Hobbs' shop and felt a sudden desire not to look at the back lane. He did not question this. He simply obeyed. And in the quiet behind the shop, where the light failed gently and the stones pretended to be simple, Mrs. Marr paused. She told herself she was passing. She told herself she was confirming. She told herself a competent lie. The latch moved beneath her fingers. It did not complain. It did not resist. It had been tested before. She did not open the window. She did not need to. She only needed to feel its looseness, like checking a bruise, to discover if it still hurt. From the far end of the lane, the scrape of a shoe. A breath. A pause that did not belong to cats. "Good evening, Mrs. Marr," Purbright said. She turned slowly. Slowly enough to be dignified, not slowly enough to be innocent. "I was just seeing if Mr. Hobb had secured his property," she said. "You are very thoughtful," Purbright replied. Her eyes moved, measuring space, distance, respectability. "You shouldn't stand alone here," she said. "I often do," he said. "It helps me understand why others do." They stood without drama. She did not confess. He did not accuse. They allowed the moment to exist. Later that night, in her parlour, Mrs. Marr sat with her hands folded and tried to convince herself that touching the latch had meant nothing. In another house, Mrs. Pole hid the small parcel again and began to be unsure whether she had ever done so before. Councillor Spinks went to bed and dreamed of council meetings in which drawers opened without sound, and Inspector Purbright, returning home, did not write anything down. He had seen what he had needed to see. He had observed what people did, not what they said. He understood now who became restless when certain sentences were spoken. He had asked for tea, he had been answered in hands, and he allowed himself the smallest, most private certainty that the final question, when it came, would not be asked in the lane at all, but in a room where respectable people could not escape without appearing to run. On the 10th day, Flinchcombe gathered without quite knowing why. It began as such things always did, with a perfectly reasonable reason that concealed a less comfortable one. A short, public meeting about commercial reassurance was called in the back room of the cooperative hall. The phrasing had the dull safety of civic language. People came because it felt safer to be inside the thing than outside it. Councillor Spinks took the chair with the brittle dignity of a man who had been expecting applause for several days that had not yet arrived. "We are here," he said, "to restore confidence." They sat on their familiar chairs. Mrs. Marr sat straight. Mrs. Pole kept her hands folded. Mr. Hobbs sat with his shoulders slightly raised, as if prepared to defend himself against furniture. Inspector Purbright stood by the window, not prominently, not invisibly, but in the exact place a man chooses when he intends to speak without appearing to. No one asked him to begin. No one asked him not to. He waited until they had exhausted their mannerisms. When the silence became too loud to be ignored, he walked to the table and placed the small tin box upon it. "I would like," he said gently, "to return something." He opened the lid. The pearls lay inside the handkerchief, as quiet as ever. Mrs. Pike gasped, though she had seen them before. "They are very peaceful," she said. "They are very deliberate," Purbright replied. He did not raise his voice. He did not adopt the posture of a revelation. He spoke as though making a soft correction to a slightly mistaken timetable. "They were not stolen," he said. "They were not dropped. They were not smuggled." Councillor Spinks cleared his throat. "Now, Inspector." "They were placed," Purbright said, and let the word exist without urgency. A breath moved through the room, not shock, recognition. "They were placed," he went on, "because something else had been taken and needed distraction." Mrs. Marr did not look at him. Mrs. Pole's hands tightened. Mr. Hobb stared at the wall as if it were safer than faces. "There has been," Purbright said, "a small arrangement in this town for some years." No one interrupted him. They had all participated in larger arrangements and knew the sound of them. "Funds collected politely," he said, "moved quietly, redistributed carefully." He paused, not for drama, but to allow truth to settle where it was going to settle. And one small part of those movements was lost. Mrs. Marr's breath caught just slightly. "Not lost," Purbright amended, "misplaced." He looked not at her, but just past her, which was worse. "A drawer that sticks," he said. "Not because it is damaged, but because something soft was once wedged into the wood while hands were not steady." Mr. Hobbs' face softened, as if finally being told he was not mad. "A window loosened," Purbright continued, Not to enter, but to retrieve. He let his gaze move around the room without accusation, without heat. No common thief, he said. No wandering stranger. He picked up one pearl between his fingers. A woman who has always prevented this town from embarrassment, he said, attempting to prevent one more. The silence was absolute. Finally, he turned his eyes, quietly, properly, towards Mrs. Marr. She did not jump. She did not cry. She did not protest. Mrs. Marr noticed, Purbright said calmly, that a small sum collected for benevolent purposes had found its way into Mr. Hobbs' keeping by accident. No one spoke. She could not ask for it, he said, because asking would mean naming it, so she replaced confusion with mystery. A truth sat down among them. Where did the pearls come from? Spinks asked weakly. From her own pieces, Purbright replied. Family, old, not worn in years. His voice held no blame. Why? Mr. Lobb asked. To give us a stranger to chase, Purbright said, to save a reputation that had never been written down. Mrs. Marr finally lifted her head. I meant no harm, she said. I know, Purbright said. A pause in which no one could quite decide what justice looked like when respectability had been trying to hide its own untidiness. She loosened the latch, Purbright went on, still gently. Not to break, only to go back once she realized where the money had lodged. Mrs. Marr's fingers folded together more tightly. I thought I could make it look external, she said. Neat. You did, Purbright replied. For a little while. There was a sound in the room that might have been a clock. There was a sound that might have been truth settling. Councillor Spinks cleared his throat again. And Mr. Clegg? A man who walks strangely, Purbright said, and that was enough. Spinks looked smaller. Mr. Hobbs spoke, not loudly. It wasn't my fault, he said. No, Purbright replied. Good, said Mr. Hobb, and sat back, relieved of a burden he had never owned. No arrests were made, no handcuffs appeared. The pearls were wrapped again in their handkerchief, not as evidence, but as conclusion. When they rose to leave, no one looked directly at Mrs. Marr. When she stood, no one moved away. Outside, Flinchcombe returned to itself with the fatigued dignity of a town that had watched itself breathe. The evening was cool. The shop windows were dark. The back lane remained a narrow, innocent stretch of stone. Inspector Purbright walked home slowly, not victorious, not disappointed. He had untangled nothing violent. He had exposed nothing theatrical. He had merely spoken the truth in a room full of people who already knew it, and had never wished to hear it aloud. Behind him, in the hall, Councillor Spinks tried to feel himself again. Mrs. Pole walked home, touching her gloves too often. Mrs. Marr adjusted her coat and found it sat differently on her shoulders. And in Flinchcombe, the calm, unavoidable truth settled into the walls, into the drawers, into the small, high windows, where it would live quietly, like everything else. By the 11th day, Flinchcombe was once again itself, which is to say that it behaved as though it had never been anything else. The shops opened with their habitual reluctance. The bells rang with their customary honesty. The pavements held only the ordinary secrets of footsteps and gum. The pearls, now rewrapped and unquestioned, sat in a drawer at the police station, not as evidence, but as something finished with, like a letter that had said everything it meant to say. At Hobbs' greengrocery, the cash drawer slid smoothly. Mr. Hobb tested it twice before trusting it. He pushed it in. He drew it out. It moved without resistance, like a man who had changed his mind about being difficult. "That's better," he told it, privately. Customers returned to their previous distances. Mrs. Larkin asked about parsnips instead of motives. Young Thomas Weaver went back to examining apples for reasons that had nothing to do with shadows. The back window remained closed. The latch sat properly in its place, modest, unambitious, and loyal again. Councillor Spinks resumed his public shape. He walked through the square with the look of a man who had never been wrong, which was kind of the town to allow him. "We handled that well," he told Mr. Lobb. Mr. Lobb made the low, supportive sound required of him. At the drapery shop, Mrs. Pole folded napkins one final time and returned the small parcel to a place so dull it looked impossible. She left it there. She did not touch it again. Some things, she felt, were better left to dullness. Mrs. Marr kept her shop open and her hands busy. She nodded to people with the same calm efficiency she always had, though she now found that her shoulders bore a memory she could not quite shrug away. She thought once of the latch. She thought once of a small, deliberate pearl. Then she thought of potatoes, because life insists. Mr. Clegg walked more slowly than ever, which did not improve his reputation but did preserve his dignity. A few people nodded to him now as if a story they had once believed had loosened its grip. He nodded back, often a little surprised, as if kindness were a foreign currency. Inspector Purbright returned to paperwork. He disliked paperwork for its noise and preferred it for its honesty. Forms had no motives. Ink did not attempt to preserve reputations. He liked the quiet of it. He wrote no report about pearls. He wrote nothing about drawers. He made no mention of windows. He recorded only that a matter of minor local disturbance had been resolved. This was true in the way all necessary lies are true. In the afternoon he walked once through the market. Men spoke of weather, women spoke of cakes, someone spoke of whether the council would ever repaint the railings. No one spoke of jewels, no one mentioned the lane, no one spoke of arrangements. This was the agreement. At the post office, Miss Anstruther resumed speaking to the clock. "They always think it was bigger than it was," she said, without looking at him. "They always do," Purbright replied. "And you?" she asked. He considered this for a moment. "I think," he said, "it was exactly as large as it needed to be." That evening, as lamps lit themselves one by one, and curtains drew their accustomed lines, Flinchcombe settled into the slow comfort of ordinary mystery. Not the exciting kind that belongs to cities, but the private, domestic kind that lives in drawers, in windows, and in the manners of people who have learned how to survive one another politely. Mr. Hobb balanced his accounts. Mrs. Marr counted nothing twice. Mrs. Pole folded nothing unnecessarily. Councillor Spinks drank his tea without tasting it. Mr. Clegg walked, unnoticed for once, through a street that had briefly tried to make him into something he was not. And Inspector Purbright sat at his desk, light pooling gently at his papers, and reflected not on triumph, but on habit. He thought of how people hid things not from the law but from themselves. He thought of how easily a town could decide upon a neat, small criminal to protect larger, more comfortable lies. He thought of how a single pearl, in the wrong place, could loosen the stitching of an entire social garment, and without writing it, without naming it, without allowing it the dignity of importance, he understood that this small, quiet town would return to peace, not because justice had thundered, but because truth had been spoken softly enough to be endured. Outside, the street lamps flickered, steady and obedient. The lane behind the greengrocer's lay narrow and empty. The small window remained faithful to its frame. And the town slept, as it always had, on the firm belief that its secrets were better maintained when no one spoke of them at all.